I didn't expect her to leave the house that morning. Not that I'd been keeping track. Well, maybe I had, in small, unnoticed ways. But when she finally stepped out, I realized how hollow the silence felt without her there. I wasn't alone for long. Her sister, the one with the quiet confidence that seemed to fill every room she walked into, sat beside me on the worn sofa and didn't move. Not a twitch, not a glance away. Just sat, like she belonged there as much as the sunlight spilling across the floorboards. It was one of those old repair shops downtown, half bookstore, half tinkering space, smelling of sawdust and paper and the faint tang of oil from the back room. I was supposed to be cataloging some old radios that had been donated, but I was distracted, tracing the scratches along the wooden armrest where she now leaned. Her jacket smelled faintly of vanilla and rain, though I had no idea how she managed to smell like that while crouched over a coffee-stained manual. She had this way of tilting her head, just slightly, like she was listening for something beyond what I was saying, or maybe something I wasn't even aware of. "I didn't think anyone still used these," she said, voice low, calm, but not detached. She picked up one of the radios, flipping it in her hands, eyes lingering on my face as if weighing whether I'd noticed the small tremor in her fingers. I tried to answer, but my voice cracked, a tiny thing, and I hated myself for it. I wanted to tell her it was, I don't know, comforting, having her here, close enough that our knees almost touched. But instead I nodded, stupidly, like that explained everything. The first few minutes were a kind of careful dance. I moved a box, she adjusted a radio dial. She hummed softly, a note that seemed to hang in the dusty air between us. I caught myself staring more than I should, not at her face exactly, but at the way the light fell across her hair, the curve of her jaw softened by the half-shadow of the shop lamp. Her eyes flicked up, caught mine, and held them for just a second too long before she looked back at the radio. Then came the small kindness that I can't stop thinking about. She handed me a rag, one of the scratchy, oil-stained ones that smelled faintly of lemon, and our fingers brushed. I felt it, even though it was just a quick contact. A static sort of warmth, the kind that lingers in your chest long after it should have ended. She didn't pull away, she didn't smile. She just let her hand linger for a fraction longer, and I could feel my heartbeat trying to fill the space she had created without a word. I wanted to ask her a dozen things. Why she sat so close, why she let me see her like this, but every time my lips opened, the words caught somewhere between my throat and the ceiling. So we worked in silence, a comfortable, weighted silence that made the air feel thick, like it had been waiting for us. And then she leaned back, just slightly, crossing her legs, still not leaving, still not letting go of the unspoken space we had made. I glanced at her hand on my knee for a fraction of a second and realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt something so sharply, so suddenly. Something that wasn't exactly desire, not yet, but wasn't nothing either. I kept thinking about that touch long after she moved, after she straightened and finally shifted her weight back into her own space. It was ridiculous, really, the way a moment so small could make my chest feel like it was going to burst. But there it was, sticking to me like the scent of her jacket in the morning sun. And I couldn't stop thinking, why does being this close feel like standing on the edge of something I don't dare name? It was the next evening when I found myself back in the cluttered shop, this time helping her sort through a stack of handwritten invoices and repair logs. The air smelled of old paper and polish, a faint metallic tang lingering from the radios we'd been cleaning the day before. She was at the counter, half buried in papers, sleeves rolled up just enough to reveal the faint lines of her wrists. I set down a box beside her, careful not to make too much noise. She glanced at me briefly, expression guarded, eyes scanning the documents before flicking away as though she hadn't even noticed me. I almost laughed at myself for leaning a little closer anyway, trying to catch the small details she didn't realize I was looking for. The way her fingers flexed nervously as she stacked the papers, the faint crease in her brow that softened when she exhaled through her nose. "You're quiet today," she said finally, not looking up. Her voice was soft, almost tired. "I mean, it's not bad. Just," she trailed off, biting the inside of her cheek, and I realized she hadn't expected me to notice that small hesitation, that tiny crack in her composed exterior. I cleared my throat, fumbling for words that didn't matter, and she glanced at me then, for just a moment, before returning to the stack. She was always like this, brief, measured gestures, a laugh that came quietly and only when she wanted it to. I watched her brush a strand of hair behind her ear, fingers lingering for a second too long on the curve of her neck. At one point, she leaned back, rubbing the bridge of her nose. "It's just been a long day," she admitted, voice lower, almost a whisper. And just like that, a wall I hadn't known was there wavered for a moment. I wanted to ask if she was okay, wanted to tell her it was fine to let someone in, but instead I just stacked another set of invoices, letting my hands brush hers briefly when she passed me a pen. The contact was electric, though subtle, as if the world had shrunk to the millimeters between us. She laughed suddenly at something I didn't even hear, that small, soft sound that seemed to ricochet off the old wooden shelves, and I noticed the faint dark circles under her eyes. She tried to hide them when she saw me looking, but I could still see it. The exhaustion, the subtle tension in her shoulders, the weight she carried silently. I wanted to lift it, or at least ease it somehow, but I didn't know how. Then she paused, hands resting on the edge of the counter, eyes fixed somewhere beyond me. I realized she hadn't spoken for a while, and I couldn't stop noticing how delicate her posture was when she didn't have to be so guarded. For a split second, it was as if she was asking, without words, if I could stay here quietly, without prying, just being. I did. I stayed. And when she finally looked up, meeting my gaze, the air between us felt charged in a way that made me almost dizzy. She didn't move closer, didn't reach out, but she didn't retreat either. Her fingers brushed the edge of mine again, almost by accident, almost as if testing something. I felt a pull I couldn't name, a quiet energy that threaded between us. And for a moment, I caught my own breath, realizing how much I wanted to linger in that small, suspended space. And then she smiled, just the corners of her lips, subtle, almost apologetic, and I couldn't stop thinking about it. It was late, later than usual. The shop had emptied hours ago, leaving just the hum of the overhead lights and the faint patter of rain against the windows. She was crouched over a tiny circuit board, her fingers tracing the connections with precision, while I hovered nearby, holding a small magnifying glass she had handed me. Our knees brushed, just slightly, but enough to make my chest tighten. "You're not even tired?" I asked, careful to keep my voice light, though my hands itched to rest on the table closer to hers, not for the work, but for the nearness. She looked up, eyes catching the dim light in a way that made her look almost fragile, almost unguarded. "Tired?" she repeated, then smiled faintly, a little crooked, like she was hiding something. I don't know. Maybe a little." The storm outside picked up, rain streaking down the glass like it was trying to wash the world clean. The sound made the room feel smaller, more intimate, and I noticed how her hair fell loosely over one shoulder, damp from a quick step outside to grab a box. I wanted to brush it away, wanted to tell her it didn't have to feel so heavy sometimes, but I said nothing. We worked side by side in a rhythm that didn't need words. At one point, I reached for a tiny screwdriver, and our hands collided midair. She froze, eyes widening just enough that I could see the flicker of something. Surprise, hesitation, maybe a spark. I pulled back immediately, though part of me wanted to stay, wanted to test what would happen if I didn't. Then her phone buzzed on the counter, breaking the spell. I saw her glance at it, a flicker of tension crossing her face, and I realized it was him, her ex. She sighed, muttered something under her breath, and silenced it without answering. I wanted to ask who it was, wanted to step closer and offer comfort, but I didn't. I stayed still, pretending my curiosity wasn't tearing at me. The room felt charged with unspoken things. I noticed the subtle tremble in her fingers, the way she blinked twice before speaking, the faint line of fatigue etched just beneath her eyes. I wanted to tell her that she didn't have to hide, that I could see it all without her saying a word, but the words caught in my throat. You've got a good eye for detail," she said finally, voice soft, almost conspiratorial, as if she was sharing a secret she didn't know she should. She leaned slightly closer to point at a solder joint, and for a moment, our faces were inches apart. My pulse spiked, and I had to look away, fumbling with the tools in my hands. Her gaze lingered on me longer than necessary. I felt that pull again, the one I couldn't name, the one that tangled everything in my chest. She didn't move closer, didn't step back, just stayed there, suspended in that brief, dangerous closeness. I could feel it in the way her breath shifted, the quiet rhythm of her presence next to mine. And then the distant rumble of thunder shook the windows, and I caught myself leaning forward slightly, almost brushing a hand against hers, almost crossing the line that neither of us dared speak aloud. But I didn't. And even as I stepped back, my chest still racing, I couldn't stop thinking about what it would have felt like if I had. I found her sitting at the small cafe across the street from the shop, rain still streaking the windows, a half-empty cup of coffee before her. She didn't look up when I approached, didn't invite me to sit, but I did anyway, perching on the edge of the booth like I belonged. The silence stretched, thick and almost uncomfortable, but not heavy, more like electricity waiting to be acknowledged. "I keep thinking about yesterday," she said finally, voice quiet, almost fragile. I didn't know how to respond, so I just nodded, waiting for her to continue. She rubbed a hand across her face, leaving a faint streak of ink from the pen she'd been using. "It's confusing," she said, almost to herself. Us. I don't even know what we're doing." Her words struck me harder than I expected. I wanted to explain, to reassure her, to say something that would make it all feel safe and normal, but the truth was, I didn't know either. I only knew the pull of her near presence, the way my chest tightened when she leaned slightly forward, the way her fingers drummed unconsciously against the ceramic mug. "I keep overthinking," she admitted, eyes fixed on the coffee, "and maybe I shouldn't. Maybe I should just leave it alone." She glanced up then, catching my gaze for a long, tense moment. There was vulnerability there, a rawness I hadn't seen before. It wasn't flirtation. It wasn't affection, not yet. It was a question without words. "Can you handle seeing me like this?" I wanted to say something, anything, but the words that came out were small, careful. I'm here," I said. And that was it. I realized I didn't need to elaborate, not yet. She exhaled slowly, shoulders dropping as if she'd been holding herself rigidly for too long. We sat together in the quiet hum of the cafe, rain drumming a steady rhythm against the glass. Each sound, each scrape of a chair, each clink of a spoon against a mug, felt magnified. I noticed the subtle tension in her jaw, the way she tucked a strand of damp hair behind her ear, the tiny tremor in her fingers as she wrapped them around the mug. Every micro-movement told me more than words ever could. "I don't want to hurt anyone," she said after a long pause. Her voice was low, trembling ever so slightly. "And maybe I already have." I swallowed hard, trying to steady myself. I wanted to reach out, wanted to touch her hand, wanted to offer some kind of reassurance that felt truthful. But I couldn't. The silence stretched between us, louder than anything we could say. For a moment, we just stared. Not at each other, exactly, at the space between us, the invisible thread that had been growing tighter with every shared glance, every accidental brush of hands. The tension wasn't about desire anymore. It was about the weight of unsaid things, the raw edge of honesty pressing into the small bubble of our world. Finally, she whispered, voice barely audible over the rain. "I don't know who I am in this anymore, and maybe that's the worst part." Her words hung in the air, devastating in their simplicity. I wanted to answer, to promise, to fix it, but there was nothing I could say that wouldn't be just another word. I realized then that some truths couldn't be softened, some silences couldn't be filled. And as I watched her cradle the mug in both hands, eyes distant, I knew the space between us had changed forever. It was quiet again in the shop, the kind of quiet that makes small sounds feel enormous. The tick of a wall clock, the scrape of a chair, the distant hum of a delivery truck outside. She was sorting through a pile of letters that had been tucked away in an old cabinet, envelopes yellowed with age. I lingered nearby, pretending to dust the shelves, but really just watching the way her hands moved, careful but hesitant, like she was touching memories that still ached. She paused at one envelope, eyes lingering over the handwriting. I, I haven't seen this in years, she murmured. Her voice cracked slightly, not from drama but from the raw weight of recognition. She hesitated, then opened it slowly, as though the paper itself might break if she rushed. I tried not to stare, but I couldn't help noticing how her fingers trembled slightly as she unfolded the letter. She glanced at me, a faint, almost apologetic smile, then returned to the words. I couldn't read it, of course, but I could feel the shift in her energy, subtle, like a breeze stirring dust in sunlight. Her chest rose and fell a little faster, her lips pressed together, eyes glimmering with something she didn't say. You ever lose someone you thought you'd never forget? She asked, voice low. I didn't answer immediately. She was looking somewhere far away, past me, past the shop itself. I mean really lose them. Not just leave them behind, but gone. And nothing makes sense afterward. I swallowed. My hands itched to reach out, but I kept them to myself. Instead, I said softly, I think. I might understand. I didn't elaborate, because words were too clumsy, too fragile. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if acknowledging the truth in my tone without needing details. For a few minutes, we were silent, each absorbed in our own thoughts. I watched her thumb over the faded ink, noticing the faint scars on her knuckles, the curve of her jaw softened by the warm light. She exhaled slowly, and for the first time in weeks, I saw a crack in the wall she carried around her, a vulnerability she didn't usually show. I didn't think I'd ever open this again, she admitted finally, almost a whisper. It's like it's still here, in a way I can't explain. Like it never really left me. Her hands shook slightly as she folded the letter back into its envelope, pressing it to her chest for a fleeting second. Something in me tightened. I wanted to tell her it was okay, that she didn't have to carry it alone, that I could be here, not as a fix, not as a replacement, but just here. Instead, I let the silence stretch, letting her grief and memory have the space it deserved. Then she looked up at me, eyes glistening, and for a fleeting moment, I thought she might speak again. Instead, she let her hand brush against mine, not on purpose, maybe, but it lingered. The contact was infinitesimal, but it carried a weight that nearly knocked the air out of me. She didn't say anything after that, but I could feel the seismic shift. Something inside her had shifted, something unspoken had opened. And I realized, with a quiet ache, that the space between us had changed in a way I wasn't sure I'd ever be able to name. I watched her tuck the letter away, her fingers brushing mine once more, and all I could think was, she'd just let me see a part of herself I wasn't supposed to. And somehow, that was enough to leave me breathless. It was late again, the shop dim except for a single lamp we hadn't bothered to turn off. Outside, the street was empty, and the rain had slowed to a quiet drizzle. She was sitting on a stool, hunched over a small stack of manuals, flipping pages as though the words could anchor her somewhere. I leaned against the counter, watching her, noticing how the light softened the lines of her face and how the faint crease between her brows didn't seem so heavy tonight. We didn't speak immediately. Words felt unnecessary, almost intrusive. Instead, we moved in the small space together with an unspoken rhythm. She passed me a screwdriver. I handed her a tiny bolt, and every small contact, fingers brushing, knees almost touching, felt like a quiet acknowledgement of what had been building between us. Finally, she sighed, a long, slow exhale, and I saw the tension ease from her shoulders. I don't know what this is, she admitted softly. Her voice wasn't questioning, wasn't pleading. It was almost a statement, simple and honest. But I know I don't want it to stop. I nodded, trying not to overthink, trying not to speak words that might break the fragile balance. Instead, I reached out and let my hand brush hers, deliberate but gentle. She didn't pull away. She didn't move closer either. She just let the contact exist, and in that simple, quiet gesture, I felt a kind of inevitability settle over us. We worked side by side for a few more minutes, small smiles exchanged over shared tasks, glances that lingered just a fraction too long, comfortable silences that felt like understanding without explanation. I noticed how her fingers flexed around the tools, the faint warmth of her hand against mine, the subtle way she leaned slightly toward the counter where I was perched. Nothing dramatic, nothing forced, just two people finally existing in the same space without pretense. At one point, she tilted her head, resting it just barely against my shoulder as she examined a circuit board. I didn't move. I didn't adjust. I just stayed still, letting her find that precarious comfort without needing to define it. And somehow, in that stillness, everything we hadn't said became visible. All the tension, the longing, the hesitation, it condensed into a quiet, shared understanding that didn't require labels. I felt the small brush of her hand on mine again, lingering, just enough to make me aware of her presence in a way that didn't need words. We sat like that for a while, letting the silence carry us, letting the room and the dim light and the small noises of the shop hold the moment between us. Finally, she straightened slightly, but our hands remained touching, relaxed but deliberate. She gave a faint, almost imperceptible smile, and I knew she felt it too. That what had been slow and uncertain and impossible to define was finally, quietly ours. I leaned back against the counter, letting her hand rest in mine, and the world outside the shop faded into the soft patter of the lingering rain. No declarations, no promises, no speeches, just presence, and the kind of understanding that felt more permanent than words ever could. And in that simple, earned connection, I realized we didn't need to speak. Being together, quietly, was enough. Looking back now, it's strange to remember how hesitant we both were at the beginning. I was younger, impatient in ways I didn't even understand yet, and she carried a kind of quiet weight. Memories, regrets, the careful armor of someone who had been hurt before. We didn't rush into anything. We didn't need to. The moments we shared were enough. Small glances, accidental touches, silences that spoke louder than any words. She taught me more about patience than I ever thought I could learn, and I think I showed her, in the quietest ways, that it was safe to let someone in again. The kind of love we found wasn't loud or dramatic. It was subtle, earned, and entirely human. There were no perfect moments, no fireworks, just afternoons spent in the shop, evenings where we lingered over coffee, and nights when a hand brushed mine and the rest of the world could disappear. I've changed. I notice the small things now, the way someone hesitates before speaking, the weight of memories they carry, the tenderness hidden behind careful words. I think she's changed too. She laughs a little more easily, lets herself rest in ways she didn't before, and sometimes I catch her staring at me, not with expectation, but with quiet acknowledgement. We see each other. We understand, without having to say it. Love, I've learned, isn't always a declaration. Sometimes it's patience. Sometimes it's presence. Sometimes it's the courage to let someone stay near, even when the past whispers that they shouldn't. We stumbled, paused, and almost stepped back more times than I can count. But in the end, staying became inevitable, not because of grand gestures, but because we learned how to be real with each other, without pretense, without pretending it was easy. The other day, I caught her in the doorway, looking at me with that small, faint smile she's perfected over the years. We didn't say a word. Our fingers brushed as I handed her a mug, and it felt like a closing of a loop we didn't even know existed. In that simple, quiet contact, I felt everything we'd built: trust, understanding, and a kind of love that is messy, slow, and entirely ours. Sometimes I still think about the first time we sat side by side in the shop, the weight of everything unsaid pressing between us. Now, it's a memory threaded with warmth, a reminder that the slowest, quietest beginnings often carry the deepest rewards. We're not perfect, and our story isn't a fairy tale, but it's real, and that, somehow, feels more beautiful than any grand romance could. If this story made you feel something, let me know in the comments. Would you want more stories like this?